Hey, Sam.
We're not each going to do our thing.
Hello to our streaming audience. We will be starting in just a few minutes. But welcome and thank you for being here.
Remarks, Q&A,
Yes, and the next person is remarks.
And then after the first round of six, we will go to probably one more, possibly two more shorter round of six.
Okay.
So you can say that'll be here.
is the speech to you or the speech to them?
So say, Mr. Chair, at least while you're reading your, after that, feel free to look around. That makes sense? What we're trying to do here is try to create as much as possible parliamentary circle style thing, but in a way that has a live audience and live camera. The times we've done this before have been interesting, and this is the first time we're doing it on this particular format, but I'm excited that it's going to.
And now we're gonna be rescued by water soon.
Yes, the waters are on the way.
And we see it in camera.
No, don't talk to the Germans, talk to the Americans. That's a lot of questions. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yes, okay, so Aaron will be giving our first speech, and our first speech is negative. Mary's second speech is negative. Frank's second speech is negative. Amy, third speech is negative. I'm just kidding. Well, we're very righteous ways, and we always prepare to give a speech on either side of the same resolution, perfectly framed so that you're saying everything you actually believe, but your user does so complex. In a way that is civil and useful to everybody.
Which one get that parliamentary candidate?
Can I get the points out?
It's, yeah, it's whichever one on the. What? All right, Jesse, are we streaming to the audience?
We are streaming.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
Hi.
I'm trying to grab my own, so thank you.
All right. If we can have everybody brought in from the outside. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Braver Angels Coliseum Debate on Populism in American Democracy, held here in the Milwaukee Central Library the day before the Republican National Convention begins. I'd like to welcome especially our wonderful guests, the locals and residents of Milwaukee, the delegates and activists and journalists coming in from out of town, our Braver Angels members and friends tuning in from all over the country, and our Braver Angels volunteers on the ground here, with whom this event could not have happened had they not been here, who are dedicating their time and sweat to protecting a sacred ideal. We are here in Milwaukee now, and will be out in Chicago next month to represent the Braver Angels way to the National Convention's delegates, and to the residents of these great cities, and to all Americans, red and blue, in this long year 2024. And that work is the same work it has been since 2017. We do our best to help Americans see the best in each other and bring out the best in themselves across all political, social, and cultural divides. We continue to do that under all circumstances whatsoever, including those which we now are in. There was a shooting at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania yesterday, and at the moment it appears that the former president is okay, and that one of his supporters and the shooter are dead. All of us on stage condemn this shameful act of violence, and we speak in today's debate in the spirit of a better and higher political culture for America. That is why thoughtful discourse and great debate and seriousness about the real stakes of our moment are so important. We see how bad things get. We see how bad things are when our political culture breaks down. We must do the little things that start with us to build it back. And one key part of that is channeling political conflict into the best possible version of itself. The speakers here, in their polemic and their scholarship and their activism, have, in my opinion, demonstrated some of the best that we can hope for in the American discourse today, in its myriad forms. They are here to help us think more clearly and strongly about the questions of populism in American history, populism in the party system of the 2020s, and populism in the Republican Party, which is meeting down the street tomorrow. What does it mean for American democracy? We're in the great Midwest, a section of America which gave this country so much of its soul, and where terms like populist and progressive and so many others show up every other decade under a dozen different faces and for a dozen different causes. How should we think about it? What do they mean in 2024 and for how should we move forward? The debates we have now on Twitter, and I hope here on the Red Angels debate floor, are not so different than the debates that have always been. And today I am honored to have a great panel of great minds and great voices who can help us think a little bit more clearly about it. So joining us on stage today are Aaron Webb, a policy analyst who runs one of the best Substack newsletters out there, and a great commentator on conservative religious, political, and policy trends. Emma Cameron, an editor over at Reason Magazine and a lucid essayist on conservative policy and politics, here for the RNC. Harry Boyd, a scholar of American social movements, and in his youth, a personal secretary to Martin Luther King Jr. Frank DiStefano, a writer on American political history's trends and cycles and the author of The Next Realignment. Amy Tutenberg, an activist in progressive and conservative communities here in Milwaukee and a local leader of Braver Angels. And Matt Hausman, a former candidate for the United States Congress in Illinois and one of our leaders here at Braver Angels. And I would like to welcome all 6 speakers into our tradition of the Braver Angels debate. Thank you all for being here. We hold Braver Angels debates on all issues under the sun with everyone who will join us, because we believe that the American people deserve a better public discourse, and that if we all bring the right spirit and submit ourselves to the right rules, we can have the discourse we deserve. The rules of today's debate are the same as those we've used in every Braver Angels debate. We will have 6-minute speeches, alternating between speeches in the affirmative and the negative. After each speech, we will have time for a few questions from the other speakers and from the audience. That's all of you. We will go through our main round of speeches and as many subsequent speeches after that as we can, and then we will adjourn and debrief. We will not take a vote because this is a debate in which nobody wins, but everybody learns from. Speakers, raise your hands to ask questions, and audience members, please raise your hands to ask questions. I will call on you when you would like me to speak. The most important rule is that every speaker and every member of the audience is only allowed to speak to me, and you must refer to me as Mr. Chair. You are not allowed to refer to anybody else in the audience or on the panel by the second person pronoun you. Please refer to everybody else on the panel and everybody else in the audience by the third person pronoun he, she, they, the speaker, the lady, the gentleman, etc. We do this because this is part of the custom of this debate that helps keep the focus on the depth of the issues that all of us bring forward. So all questions about the speaker's speeches will be addressed to me, please. We also ask that for audio pickup and traditionalism reasons, that when you hear something you like, you do not hoot or shout or clap, but you instead join us in a custom that we have maintained from the earliest days of Braver Angels debate called banging. So if you hear something you like, if you want to support speakers in something they're saying, please take the flat side of your hand and bang on your chair or stamp your feet, and that will be the way that you can best express that you enjoy your speeches. So pretend I just said something really funny and amusing and you want to see me chair the rest of this debate. Thank you. Please do that for our speakers here and for your fellow members of Braver Angels, and it will be something that I think we'll have a longer discourse. And speaking of ways, the most important of these is the Braver Angels way, the spirit of all we do. We state our views freely and fully without fear. We treat people who disagree with us with honesty, dignity, and respect. We welcome opportunities to engage those with whom we disagree. We believe all of us have blind spots, and none of us are not worth talking to. We seek to disagree accurately, avoiding exaggeration and stereotypes. We look for common ground where it exists, and if possible, find ways to work together. We believe that in disagreements, both sides share and learn. In Braver Angels, neither side is teaching the other, but giving feedback on how to think or say things differently. And that is the Braver Angels way. I call this Coliseum debate to order. Resolved, populism is a force for good in American democracy. I am looking for a first speech in the affirmative. The gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you. My thing designated as in the affirmative, but I would call this 2 cheers for populism, or maybe 1.5 cheers. Populism plays a key role in our system as a warning indicators of problems in our society, both in terms of public sentiment and substantive problems. Populism is not capable of governing directly, but it is a signal to those who are. Similar to the oil light or the temperature gauge in your car, when you get that indicator something is wrong, you need to take action because it's telling you something is wrong with the engine. And if you don't, then you may end up with a much bigger problem. The Trump era populism is in many respects a replay of the early 90s populism. I sometimes like to say, I've seen this movie before and it was better the last time. And one reason we have it is because we did not deal with the issues that were raised by people like Pat Buchanan and H. Ross Perot. Instead, we decided to quarantine that sentiment and essentially expel it from both parties. Fast forward, what are the consequences of that? Number one, they were right and the economists were wrong about job loss from trade with places like China. As we see, only 20 years later, people like David O'Toole with the China stocks have acknowledged. Secondly, we see serious issues in our defense and industrial complex. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're having difficulties building enough artillery shells. Something as low-tech as artillery shells. Much of our supply chain is now entangled with a geostrategic competitor. We can't manufacture submarines fast enough, etc. And then for those who dislike Donald Trump, I would submit that he was able to tap in that discontent that was never addressed the first time. And I say this is not just as an American phenomenon, but a global phenomenon. We see, for example, in Europe that immigration, as in the United States, has been a major issue. In the UK, they did not take any steps to deal with immigration, and Brexit happened, which completely disrupted the trade relationships and the relationships with the rest of their continental European partners. It still hasn't been addressed. And we also see in Denmark that it was in Denmark that a center-left government actually listened to public sentiment and adopted an immigration restrictionist position. And as a result, there's no populism in Denmark, and it's one of the few countries where the center-left has been doing very well in Europe. So I feel like, again, populism is merely a signal that something has gone wrong, but that's an important function. And if we don't listen to it, we fail to do so at our peril. Thank you.
Let's go to questions for the speaker. The gentleman from Illinois, please stand.
Mr. Chair, the speaker made some great points, and I would like to ask the speaker what his thoughts are on actual populist leaders. And does that cause more problems? Does that undercut some of the issues that are raised by the populist movements when they actually get directly involved in government? So how would the speaker respond to those?
Please, Mr. Rick.
I would say that, in my view, in general, populist leaders are not especially capable of governing. That's why I say that populism is not really capable of governing. You need people who are part of the governing elite to adopt. I think there are possibly some exceptions. Viktor Orban in Hungary has been an effective leader. We may disagree with his policies, but he's been an effective leader. But I think in general, the leaders of populist movements tend not to be the most effective administrators or governing leaders themselves personally.
Let's go to further questions for the speaker. The lady in the black, please rise. And please speak loudly so we can hear you.
Mr. Speaker.
I am Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if the speaker could define populism I would be curious to know if everybody on stage defines it similarly or exactly the same. So.
Please remain silent. Mr. Speaker.
That's a great question. I don't have like a great political science definition of it, but in general, I would define it as a mass popular discontent from people at or below the median socioeconomic status in the country aimed at the elites or people who are in the governing class of society. You can think of, for example, the classic peasants' revolt against the aristocracy as being a sort of archetype of populism. That's how I would basically define it.
Let's go to one final question from the speaker. The lady in the back, please rise.
Mr. Chair, correct? I guess as the kickoff of this debate has started, I guess I object to that description.
But please object.
I'm sorry, I object to the speaker's characterization of people that would define populism as people that are not necessarily peasant class, but akin to that, or that they are not good at governing, or that they are, the characterization seems negative to me. If that's the characterization we're going to use, I'd like to challenge that right from the beginning.
And let's challenge that in the form of a question.
I believe that, do you agree?
Does the speaker agree?
Okay, does the speaker agree that part of the populist movement currently could be directed at the class of elites rather than only solved or led by the elites? The speaker is indicating that potentially a better world is where elites may lead the populist movement, but that the populist movement itself is made up of people who are not elite. I would say it's a response to elitism rather than, say, low to middle class people that have decided that they're, however he's characterizing it now.
I appreciate this question, Mr. Wren, you can
Yeah.
have your.
I think that there probably are some leaders that you would describe as populists who are capable of governing, in a sense, someone who establishes himself as the leader of a populist movement is, in a sense, elite. Donald Trump would fall into that category. Donald Trump himself is not from the bottom half of society, but nor was he part of essentially the governing class of America. And so we live in a representative democracy in which we expect leaders in our country to represent the people. And a part of populism arises when the people who are part of that representative class, all of the different factions and groups within Congress or within our government, a material share of our population and their sentiments are not being expressed at that level, or not included. In Europe, they have the cordon sanitaire against the so-called party. There's certain beliefs that you're just not allowed to hold. We see that, I think, for example, with immigration. I think there's tremendous widespread discontent with the scale of immigration into America, illegal immigration. And yet, the kind of consensus of both parties in Washington was that we have more immigration. And so that leads to discontent. So I feel like we do have to have representatives in that elite class when we say represent populism, in a sense, they may have that, but they have to be people who are not merely charismatic pitchmen who are able to get elected, but they have to actually be able to govern and participate in the governance process of a pluralistic society.
Let me ask the speaker one final question, and please take this briefly if you can. What would need to happen for the speaker to give populism a third chair, not just the two chairs you mentioned earlier here?
If there were a populism whose leaders, who's representative of the populist group, were able to effectively govern, not just exclusively for their own group, but for the broad needs of society, then I would say you would get your third chair.
And that, the speaker is next. All right, now we're looking for our first speech in the negative. Ms. Kemp, you have 5 to 6 minutes.
Populism is not a force for good in American democracy, with a disclaimer. Populism Populism is not a force for good in American democracy on balance, because the kind of populism that's currently taking hold in America is a distinctly illiberal populism. Simply defined, populism is any political movement that claims to champion the people over the elite. As a small L libertarian, there are times where I think populism can be a force for good, because I think there are plenty of times where the American elite gets things wrong. The problem with the kind of populism that's infected America's political life is its fundamentally illiberal streak and its proponents' willingness to wield the state to suppress individual liberties in service of populist causes. So, what do I mean by illiberal populism? Populism is any political movement that pits the little guy against the big guy. Illiberal populist movements are ones that are willing to break liberal norms to achieve their goals, and might even view certain individual freedoms as themselves a product of elite corruption. You can find illiberal populism behind Florida's Stop Woke Act, which sought to limit the spread of progressive elite views on race and gender by unconstitutionally limiting the academic freedom of public college professors. You can also find it in Texas's law prohibiting private businesses from enacting mask or vaccine mandates on their own property. You can also find it among many democratic socialists who actively use liberal as an insult and argue that America's system of individual liberties primarily serves capitalists. In each of these examples, attacking institutions or ideas largely opposed by the people is used to justify wielding state power to limit individual freedoms. According to many illiberal populists, basic liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of association can be cast aside in service of the right goals, whether that's loosening libel laws to go after left-wing journalists, or protecting children from reading the wrong library books. The ends simply justify the means. Sure, you might be thinking, the current strain of populism in American politics is anti-liberal, but so what? Why can't we prioritize achieving important political goals over lofty ideals? Here's where I have to sell you on the broader argument. America's liberal tradition is of vital importance to the health of its democracy, and key to that liberal tradition is the recognition that the will of the people alone cannot justify overruling certain basic rights. James Madison wrote extensively about the challenges of building an ideologically diverse democracy. Individual liberty, he argued, breeds diversity of opinion, but that diversity creates lots of conflict. But Madison argues that this is no good reason to extinguish individual rights in the name of uniparty peace. As he wrote in Federalist 10, it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life and nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air. Very different Americans are able to live together in this country because we can engage in ideological conflict safe in the knowledge that the Constitution protects us from having certain rights taken away because they become unpopular with the majority of voters. As my colleague Stephanie Slade wrote for Law and Liberty, people who are confident that their rights are secure from assault by competing factions will have far less of an incentive to engage in assault on competing factions. Also worth noting, Slade's insight shows how illiberal populism on the right begets illiberal populism on the left and vice versa. American democracy thrives because the Constitution and its amendments make it nearly impossible for the illiberal populist dream to come true. No matter how much Ron DeSantis wants, he can't rewrite college curriculums or ignore libel law. And those protections keep dissenting voices active and serve as a warning against similar attempts. Ultimately, Americans are most frequently secure in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when we live in a nation that prizes individual freedom over collective tyranny. After all, when you believe the ends justify the means, it's nearly impossible to avoid letting the ends become downright authoritarian. With the time I have left, I want to make a secondary argument, which is that populist economics frequently have disastrous effects for the very Americans they're supposed to help. Populist economics has the primary goal of protecting the working class by engaging in things like heavy tariffs, limiting immigration, and significant entitlement spending. Right now, the economic squeeze that many Americans are feeling is a direct result of populist economics. Dramatic post-COVID spending for both parties and long-existing protectionist trade laws have led to incredibly high inflation. And inflation is bad news, especially for those who live on margins. Only 1/4 of Americans said the economy was excellent or good in a Gallup poll, and 41% listed inflation as their top economic issue in April of this year, up from 8% in 2021. Both Trump and Biden have leaned into economic populism, proposing and enforcing new tariffs that are only likely to make this problem worse. One recent analysis of Trump's proposed slate of new tariffs estimated that it would cost the average American family $1,700 annually. It's often said that a tariff is a tax. In this case, it's easy to see how it's a tax that hits working class Americans hardest. So no, neither illiberal populism nor economic populism is good for American democracy, and it's not good for Americans either.
Time for questions for the speaker. We have questions for the speaker. The gentleman in green.
What means does the speaker believe are necessary to protect individual rights from encroachment by the majority?
I think the Constitution does a great job of that already. We have both the Bill of Rights, we have significant amendments to the Constitution that protect things like freedom of speech. I write about free speech a lot, so a lot of my examples are probably going to be free speech. But yes, technically we can amend the Constitution, but it's very, very difficult to do so. So the fact of the matter is that, a majority of Americans, if they wanted to say hate speech is now illegal, we can't put that up for a vote. We can technically amend the Constitution, but it's almost certainly not going to happen. And that fundamentally is what protects people with unpopular minority views.
Further questions for the speaker? Gentleman in red, please rise.
Mr. Chair, the speaker at the beginning self-identified as a small L libertarian. In my experience, libertarians would generally have a serious problem with the government doing something, but if a large corporation does the same thing, they will generally not say anything about it. So when Facebook or Google censor people of certain views, they generally won't have an issue with that. All of these companies are identifying as...
Please frame this as a question for the speaker. I think I know where you're going.
Okay, what do you think should be, what does the speaker believe should be done when corporations are violating the rights of individuals, and have protections in place that do not allow for the population to act against them?
Thank you. Excellent question.
So one of the key rights provided by the First Amendment, Mr. Speaker, is freedom of association. We're all doing a great job of remembering. Mr. Chair, is the freedom of association. So people often say corporations aren't people, but they're made up of people. And those people, those private institutions, are allowed to set their own rules. I don't want Facebook to be forced to keep speech on its own website that it doesn't want to, especially the government forcing it to do so. Also, the amazing thing about the nation that we live in is, say, look with Donald Trump's new social media website, Truth Social. He didn't like the rules on Twitter, and so he made his own website with his own rules.
This is helpful, and I will look forward to further speeches and questions on that topic. Another question from the lady in the maroon, please rise.
How would the speaker solve the problem of inflation?
I figured they got to have your life for what it's worth. I don't know how I would solve the problem. You're good.
Yeah, that one's a doozy. But for sure, I would probably curb government spending tremendously. Our national debt is out of control. Government spending is out of control. We're running a massive deficit. And we pour money into the economy, prices rise. So I would probably cut government spending tremendously. I wish I had a magic wand, but unfortunately I don't.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a debate that is about populism. There are ways that inflation is kind of about populism. I will smile about all speeches and answers in regards to it. I have one brief question here, and I think the speaker seems to be suggesting that populism is inherently illiberal. And I'm just wondering if the speaker believes that that is a necessary fact, or if there has ever been any kind of populism at whatever level that has not been intrinsically illiberal.
So I don't think it's intrinsically illiberal. I think the kind of conditions that create populist movements are more likely to be illiberal, because sort of how I define illiberal populism is a populist movement that that is basically willing to break the rules of our liberal democracy in order to achieve its aims. And we've seen that happen quite a lot throughout history. I think it's possible for there to be liberal populism. I think it's possible for there to be populism that isn't inconsistent with liberalism. An example that's coming to mind, some people might disagree that this is populism, but I think about something like the school choice movement, which was started primarily by working class Black parents who were upset at the education the government was giving abandoned their children and demanded something better. I don't see anything with that that's contrary to American values at all, but that was certainly a movement by people who were in the lower classes, who were in minority racial group by and large, and demanded the government do something better rather to escape from what the government was providing for their families.
And that, speaker and questioners are thanked. Thank you very much. Continuing on through speeches in the affirmative and the negative, I would continue to invite questions both from the audience and from members of our panel. And with that, I am looking for another speech in the affirmative. Dr. Boyd, you have 5 to 6 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak in the affirmative. Populism is a force for good in American democracy. But I want to begin by saying populism in this sense needs to be broadened and redefined. Today it entirely exists along an ideological spectrum of left, right, or center, electorally, ideologically. We need an orthogonal axis, or put differently, a third dimension, which doesn't simply look at the formal political system and parties and politicians, but looks at the popular movements, which actually were the root of the term populism, like the farmers' cooperative movement and black and white farmers in the South and the Midwest in the 1880s and 90s, or the Grange, another great example. So I want to begin by briefly noting the flaws of the narrow definition of populism we inhabit, we're imprisoned by. I want to describe the much richer notion of populism as about self-organizing people's activities to build communities and to create common goods. I was shaped by that tradition, and the civil rights movement is on this track. And thirdly, I want to talk about how out of that there's a kind of civic formation or development, a shift from people as mobs, which happens in simply electoral activity called populism, to publics, people who are disciplined, long-term in their vision, sober, language that Hannah Arendt used in distinguishing mobs from publics. She also talked about that as real populism. So first, we now live in a world in which populism is defined in ideological and party politics times. And I would say it reflects one side of the American democratic experiment. It's in fact, interestingly enough, in Steve Bannon's interview recently with David Post in the New York Times, he says what populism is doing in the Trump version is bringing the country back to a constitutional republic. Well, that was James Madison's Federalist Papers then. We are a republic, we're not a democracy. But that wasn't the only part of the American experiment. So when Thomas Jefferson said, give to the first class, give to the people themselves, the only safe repository of power is the people themselves, and if you think they're not wise enough to exercise discretion, it remedies education and self-education. He was talking about an older tradition that preceded the revolution. Hamlin's book, Oscar and Mary Hamlin's book, Commonwealth, is really important on this. Colonists came from England and they built communities. And that was the seedbed of the American experiment. And they organized churches and town meetings, cooperatives, grazing lands, and local government. The people were the creators of government, which is very distinctive compared to other societies when government is seen as passed down from antiquity. Well, that was the reason we have we the people in the Constitution. We the people created government. It's also there, interestingly enough, in the 10th Amendment, which reserves all powers to the people, not specifically delegated to the government. So, what does this mean in practice? Well, if we only think about populism in politics broadly as about elections and government, the Federalist view, what happens is citizens become voters, delegating authority, and they also become consumers. And I would say American democracy is greatly worked by the consumer view that's taken hold. And it's created a politics of grievance and victimization and competition and very little sense of citizenship. The experience I had as a young man in the civil rights movement was a very different kind of populism. So it was populism. I'll give a story that illustrates. I was working as a field secretary, not a personal secretary, for Martin Luther King in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964.
My apologies. Thank you for the clarification.
And I had a friend who went to the jail, old jail, and she was okay. I was worried about her. Came back out to the parking lot. 5 men and a woman. It was a very violent summer, by the way. Always getting beaten up by the Klan. 5 men and a woman surrounded me. And I realized, oh my God, they followed me out from town. And they said, we know what you are, you goddamn communist Yankee. We're going to take care of you, boy. And my southern roots saved me, came to my rescue. I said, well, I'm a Christian, so I believe in love of blacks and whites, every person who has dignity. But I ain't no Yankee. I'm a Southern boy. I come from North Carolina from before this revolution, and I certainly ain't no communist. I'm a populist. I just got from some occasional reference of my dad, who had become a leader of integration in Atlanta as head of the Red Cross. But working best, Scottish guy. I said, what that means is I think y'all are being fooled. The big shots in town are messing over both of us. You and us. And you should be on our side. And then I was quiet looking to see if this had an effect. And this old guy in coveralls scratches his head and says, well, you know what? I think there may be something to that. He said, I don't know if I'm a populist, but he said, I know what you're saying is true. I'm not a dummy. And I've read about populism. He said, the big shots in town will call me up and say, we've done a great job beating you all up, but they would never talk to me on the street. They don't respect us. A couple of days later, I told Martin Luther King about this. You know what he said? He said he sees the civil rights movement as a new expression of democratic populism, not, flamboyant democratic populism. And he said he gave examples like the the Southern Tenant Farm unions and the rural electrification and cooperatives. So, where did that come from? Well, it comes out of a rich history of community building in America, in which people were not consumers. They were producers and co-creators. They were builders of public goods like schools and libraries and community centers and religious institutions and local government. And this was especially powerful in the African American experience. So one of the things I've been doing a lot of research on is an unknown story, a tremendously important popular story of black communities in the South during Jim Crow, which created 5,000 schools and 10,000 libraries through their own sweat equity that became the foundation for the whole civil rights movement. And you go on and on. Coretta Scott King and John Lewis and Medgar Evers and Maya Angelou and the Little Rock Nine, they all went to Rosenwald schools. And so that's a history that really we need to reclaim as part of the populist equation. The third thing I want to make is the point that actually is also develops a particular kind of civic consciousness which we need. I saw this in the March on Washington. I was impressed by Dr. King's speech. Heard him practice it actually before he gave it in his room next door. Dad went on the staff of SCLC in '63 as an assistant. Okay. The march was impressive not only because of King's speech, but because of the demeanor, the civic dignity and discipline of the people. And it was embodied in the program notes, which said, In a neighborhood dispute, there may be stunts, rough words, and hot insults. But when a whole people speaks to the government, the quality of the action and the dialogue need to reflect the worth of the people and the responsibility of the government. That was exactly what Arendt was getting at in the distinction between mobs and publics. And that's the kind of citizenship formation we need today. Now, I have a great quote from Walt Whitman which conveyed that, but I think I can put that in the question. Thank you.
And that's
Mr. Chair, the decline of civil society, intermediary institutions, voluntary associations has been much lamented in our country. Is it possible for us to recreate that in the presence of a federal government and the government in general of the incredible scale that we have today that intrudes into essentially every aspect in our lives, both administratively and essentially therapeutically?
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair, just to respond to the questioner, we'll take new forms. But there's all sorts of civic ferment below the surface. The National Civic Leaders is about to come out with a study of 10,000 examples of new forms of civic life and democracy building effort that are really at the grassroots of American society, that are invisible. They're invisible because nobody talks about populism in the real sense. They talk about it as a political football. So, no, actually, I think, and there are a lot of important dimensions of your question. I think democratic populism for today needs to address the secession of elites, professional elites from the people, from the identities of the parts of the mix, needs to address the unaccountable concentration of corporate power. But the finance is beginning to improve.
Let's go to a question from the gentleman in the future. Is this a question?
Yes.
Sir, please ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the speaker's sort of broad definition of a more productive citizenship. And just my brief context into the question, I guess if I look at democracy as something that is not a fixed destination or outcome, but a way of living and a culture and a way of thinking, then populism is one of the ways in which it gets a voice for ordinary people who might not otherwise have access to self-governance that Thomas Jefferson talked about. And I think that's where maybe the speaker is going. Would you, would the speaker please comment and respond to the question of, because it was mentioned by the first speaker, of the deficiencies or problems that have come up with populist governing leaders. Thank you. What I'm wondering is if the speaker could talk about or answer that it's exactly the nature of populism or not that is not intended to be a governing system, but a way of the people holding the governing authorities accountable, and how that dance or nuance has been failing or could be improved as a way for populism and governing structures and institutions to coexist.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, take this up.
Appreciate the question. So, there's never a democratic populism without a democratic people and a lot of democratic self-organization. If that grinds out, if we're all in our own basements looking at videos, we're going to have a nation of consumers, not of citizens. And I think that's dangerously where we have been going. If you have actually vital democratic self-organizing activity, as in the history of Wisconsin and Minnesota and the upper Midwest, full of stories of cooperatives and farm experiences and experiments and self-education groups, and then you get a kind of populist electoral politics and policies, which is different than we have today. It's not simply politicians trying to manipulate us. And just two examples. Hubert Humphrey called himself a populist. And he sponsored many programs to advance citizenship, including the Peace Corps, but also he was a great champion of civil rights. But Humphrey is a good example of a politician who became a populist politician because of his experiences in civic life. So I was a Humphrey faculty person for many 20 years. I used to tell my students to read Humphrey's father's autobiography, which was about a small town in Dolan, South Dakota, where he was one of 5 Democrats in a town of 600 Republicans, different religion too. And Humphrey Sr. made that drugstore the vital civic center of Dolan. He was even elected mayor at one point, which he said was the least important thing he had done. His life was to create a civic culture in Dolan, and Humphrey said many times, including that book, that was where he learned real politics. I would also give examples like Al Quee, who was a congressman, Republican from Minnesota in the 1960s, very strong supporter of the freedom movement, but also as governor later, had all sorts of ways to respect and involve and appreciate citizens, including, by the way, Dodgers. But he didn't see that as a private thing. He saw that as a potentially a public seedbed of culture and development.
Harry, I want to get a couple more questions in.
So I think should be
just they're very great answers. All right, to the question from the Lady of American Hope, please. Be loud.
Mr. Chair, Braver Angels is an organization that's engaged in civic renewal. I'd be very curious to hear from the speaker his ideas about specifics that could be done to renew our civic life, and if he wants to put in a plug for Braver Angels.
Excellent. So, Mr. Chair, I appreciate the speaker's question very much, and I appreciate it. We had a Braver Angels convention a couple of weeks ago down in Tennessee. And there, you can see the seedbed of populism arriving in the Democratic society. So, for example, there was a watch party, equal numbers of reds and blues, and then some crazy independents and a few populists like me. And we watched the debate together. And everybody was equally involved. But rather than lament or despair, Monica Kutzman, the podcaster of Braver Angels, said, they're not going to fix it. We have to fix it. And that is precisely the kind of assumption of agency, responsibility, civic power that we're going to need. And you're right, this last convention also made several advances, including adding to the platform that we celebrate and advance the spirit of the Republic and also democracy as a way of life. So both of those are there. A major advance. I don't think any other major civic organization in the country has taken that position and used language of we have to learn how to work across our differences in community problems, develop the capacity to be conveners, really to be the seedbed of a new kind of civic practices.
Well, Harry, thank you for coming up. Let's go to another question. We saw. Question from Ms. Kent.
I'm wondering how the speaker would incorporate into his argument the fact that many of the anti-civil rights movement backlash movements were themselves populist, and thinking of politicians like George Wallace, where there was a distinctly populist, racist backlash from, say, working class white Southerners who viewed their economic and social positions as being challenged by equal rights for African Americans.
Well, I have a great colleague, David Matthews, who was Secretary of HEW under 04, and he tackled the problem of school desegregation. And he had a very innovative approach that the government did not follow up on. He tried to create a commission on this. But Matthews said, if you look at the South, there are many examples of people coming together, working class whites and poor whites and black communities across racial lines to think about how can we have integration without the end of local schools. That was Matthew's approach. And that was a genuine democratic populist policy. And that's the kind of thing we need to do again. He tried this, Sean Spiegel on it, he did something similar with disability questions. But that was seeing the people as a source of solutions and ideas and creativity, not another Washington is the all in all and deal.
Let's go to Wallace's populism ban.
Well, Wallace changed, actually. And he changed because of the interaction of his life. One of the things about populism, this is, I think, also another religious principle, you always believe in redemption. You believe in redemption. I think, but I don't think politicians are prone to that very easily. I think that people in real communities where they get to know each other and expand their imaginations of who we the people include, that's how real democratic change occurs.
I will smile on further speeches and questions about the nature of redemption or this as well too. But let us go to one final question for the speaker, related to the wonderful leafy dress.
Thank you. Leafy dress here. I'll try to do better than my last question.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
Okay. Mr. Chair, please ask the speaker if we do agree with this statement, incorporating the speech from earlier and his speech. I'm very encouraged by the depth of his redefinition, but also, would he agree that one step closer to this concept of the people taking back onto their responsibility and all of the things that you said? As a conservative woman, one of the things that I see is a polarization that might be, in my opinion, a con, in a way, as Americans. Are we really that polarized, right? We all care about our children. We all care about our communities. And so as a conservative woman, would you agree that one step closer to that is to first acknowledging that fact? It is not that women are extremists. It's not that women are homophobes or people that disagree with certain agendas or illiberal populism as you've defined. Women are women, people are people. We love our children, we love our communities, we care about those that cannot help themselves. We all do. Could we get on the same side of the table and look at the issues together?
Mr. Speaker, take that how you like. This is a important question on common ground.
Well, common ground is kind of important. So let me thank the questioner for a very important question. And I think, again, this goes to the point that we need to think not mainly ideologically, but we need to think in terms of themes like how do we build together healthy, flourishing, inclusive communities. And a former student of mine, Ben Fake, who's now working with Braver Angels, the partners, and also the alliances in the East Coast, starts off by meetings thinking of who really cares about this community. They do a power map. They bring people together, and regardless of party affiliation, 80 or 90% say we really want to build a good community. We're much more interested in that than in ideological issues. So I think actually it's a very promising approach. It points to the possibilities for a real civic renaissance if we dedicate time and talent to that.
And with that, Dr. King's field secretary. Now we'll speak with the negative, Mr. DeStefano. You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, it is my conception that populism is not a force for good. It's not a force for good for the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, for any political party, because it is at odds with the American idea and our conception of what democracy is supposed to be about. Now, the conception of American democracy is the arena, right? In American democracy, politics is a place where we come together, we talk, we battle, we discuss over the things that we want and need. And what we're supposed to do is get some of the things that we want, all the things that we need, and well, we're not going to get all the things that we want. We'll eventually get to a conclusion that everybody can live with. And the genius of this is it unleashes the ability to fix problems, to actually sort of be a dynamic country, builds things and solves things while have nobody dominating anybody else. Because nobody gets to dominate you, you don't get to dominate anybody else, and we get to solve all of our problems. That's the American conception of democracy, the arena. Now populism disagrees with that conception completely. It says politics is something else entirely. To the populist, politics is a battle. It is a battle between the people and the elite. There is on one hand the people, and the people or the general will, they have the sort of the spirit of the country in them. And on the other side, there's this elite. Now, the elite may be common citizens, they may have the same passport, they may live down the block as your neighbors, but they're not really one of us. They are a different group of people. And politics is about fighting in this battle between the struggle of who's going to get control of the levers of government. Is it going to be the people, who are the will of the people, or this group of outsiders, this group of elites? Now, some people have this perception that this is a fight about class or about power or resources. That the idea is that the people, it's the working people, rural people, class, these are people without power and control. And what they're doing is they're coming into the debate to fight with people who have this power and control. But when you look at it, it's really not that at all, because what they're fighting about, the populist is not a communist and is not an anarchist. They know that there's going to be a head of a CEO of a company. Someone's going to have a lot of wealth and power. They don't have a problem that somebody has wealth and power. There's going to be president, there's going to be senate. Those people are going to have wealth and power. They don't have a problem with that. They're not trying to rip power down and make us all equal. They're fighting about who gets the power, who has the wealth, who has the power. And they want to make sure that it's them, that the power goes to people like us. It doesn't go to people like them. That the power belongs in the hands of the people like us. It isn't in the hands of the elite, them, the other, the people like them. So when you look at it, what is populism? Actually, it is a type of identity politics. It is another form of identity politics, defining identity around culture and values. And it says that there's this group of people who have certain values and culture that is the spirit of the nation, and they should be in control because we have self-determination. Only the people of the nation should be in control of the nation. So by self-determination, they should be running the country. And then there are these outsiders. They share our passports, but they are not one of us. And for them to have control, that means we don't have self-determination. And there are these outsiders. We're basically an occupied country. And that therefore, the goal of politics is this struggle. Will the people control their own nation, or will the outsiders, who aren't us, be able to control the nation at our expense? And that's what politics is actually about. And it's a fight over legitimacy. It says it's legitimate. The only legitimate answer is that we, the real people of the country, the real Americans, the real Germans, the real Brazilians, whatever it is, that we have the right. It's only legitimate if we win, if we control the country. It's illegitimate if they win because they're not one of us. Okay? This is at odds with the entire idea of American democracy, of the arena. The arena means we all come in and we all fight together and we get all the things we need, and some but not all the things we want. But the idea of the populist is that politics is actually a struggle over who gets to control the levers of government. There are levels, or not just government, all society, corporation, wealth, power. There are levers of power. Someone's going to get them. And we need to make sure the people who get them are us. We have to make sure the people who get them aren't them. Now, anyone who knows anything about the American founding knows the big concern has always been tyranny of majority. We have a democracy. We don't want a tyranny. The arena is about not having a tyranny. Nobody is controlling and dominating anybody else. But the populist conception is, no, there's going to be a tyranny of the majority. Somebody is going to get it. We have to make sure that we get the tyranny and that they don't get the tyranny. And that is a very un-American idea. It's also a very destructive idea. Because this is an idea, the genius of the arena is it allows us to organize things, to get things done, and be dynamic, to build things, to make things, to solve problems. And this is why America has been so successful. And countries that have this model of democracy have been successful. And the populist idea, it creates division. It creates disorder. It makes it impossible to build things, to solve problems. Because this idea of grasping and grabbing the tyranny makes it impossible to do the things that make America great. So this is why, Mr. Chair, it's my conception that populism is not a force for good. I think it's an un-American idea that stands in the way of us reaching the American dream.
And that, the speaker is questions from the panel and questions from the audience. Let's get to a question from the lady in the black. Please rise.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about the speaker's point that populism is a form of cultural identity politics, and I'm curious to hear the speaker's thoughts on whether populist rhetoric truly reflects the wants and desires of a cultural majority, or whether it is sort of propagated to influence or create a perceived cultural majority.
Interesting, Mr. Speaker.
All right. To address the question, Mr. Chair, I would say one of the things that's interesting, and I think this is answering the question. A lot of populists believe that they are for, in fact, democracy, right? They would argue that but if you listen to what they're saying, they're for democracy within the people. The idea is that democracy is great, of which of the people get to rule. So we're going to have democracy amongst ourselves, but there should be not democracy between us and the elite because they're inherently illegitimate. So therefore, this whole idea that it's a check on power isn't exactly right. It's the check is within the group. As long as the person, so if the president is George Bush, he's one of us. That's great. This is democracy. One of us wins. It's John Kerry. He's one of them. So now we have a problem, right? It's about who gets that control. And the democracy is a intergroup competition amongst the populists. But the only legitimate outcome is that the populists wins.
Let's go to the question from the lady from Milwaukee.
Yes. What language would the speaker recommend that politicians that are campaigning against their opponent use instead that would not have that sentiment? Because wouldn't that always be something that they would want to represent? They represent people and they don't. What is a different alternative to that mode of campaign?
Well, I mean, my answer to that would be, the answer is always to talk in terms of us and the American people. I mean, there are two models for a successful politician. There is the successful politician, Mr. Chair, who does talk in terms of us versus them. It's a very successful model. People win this way all the time. But there is another model of very successful politicians who talk like Abraham Lincoln, who say that we are a country that is divided, but our divisions are put aside the fact that we are Americans, we are us, and that it is the job of the leaders of the country to represent all of us. And that there's a big fight that people have sometimes in government, but there's two models that people have in their heads. People who think, when I win, am I a representative of my political party? And that I am supposed to use the office as the head of my political party to achieve the political party's goals. Or when I win, do I put my party aside and I become a representative of all the people who didn't vote for me too? And I have an obligation to represent them all.
Question from the lady from Detroit.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very interested in the speaker's point that this is populism is a form of identity politics, and it made me think of the notion of luxury beliefs, which are essentially holding a bad idea that doesn't correspond with reality because it doesn't affect your group, but it signals membership in that group. I wonder, has the speaker heard of this idea? Does it fit? It seems the way it's mostly used to represent the elites. Is there a populist version of luxury beliefs? What is the speaker's take about this idea?
I would say, Mr. Chair, I mean, I have heard of luxury beliefs, and I think it's a real thing. I think that there is a tendency to, well, there are two different ways that you can look at the point of politics that I see sometimes, where there are, in my conception, it's about thinking, it's about problem solving. If the point of problem solving problems is always sort of not, it doesn't feel good, because actually solving problems it's messy, it's complicated, it's not satisfying, it never works right. You get some of what you want, but not all of it. It's always a kludge, and everyone's dissatisfied about it. But if your goal is to solve the problem, that is what you have to do. There are other people who look at politics as a way to satisfy the feeling that they want. They're like, there is a problem, I feel bad about it, and I want to do something that makes that feeling go away. And it has to be emotionally satisfying, even if it works or it doesn't work. And I would support things, and the argument that this doesn't work is irrelevant and you can't win over, because to that person, Politics is about making that feeling go away, and they want a dramatic effort that seems like it's directly solving the problem, even though it's dumb and it won't solve the thing they want, because their goal isn't to solve the problem. Their goal is to feel it.
Question from the non-Yankee from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I would actually like to ask the speaker, if he rejects the notion that populism has two dimensions, that it has an electoral dimension, that it could certainly identity politics these days, but it also has a popular dimension of local work to build public goods, great school tradition that Lawrence Clement described, or that's so vivid in the Roosevelt School, all about negotiating and coming to some common good that was much more than. So, do you reject that distinction?
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair, I would put it that I don't reject the distinction, but I see it differently. As I said in my remarks, I don't reject the idea that both political parties have not done enough to represent working people, people without institutional power. Because institutions who get things done, who implement ideas, have to have leaders, and those leaders tend to come from a similar class. And there are people in society that can pick up the phone and know somebody who works at the agency, who knows somebody who's on the board of directors of the company, and they have an extra access in democracy that most of us do not. And that for people who do not, their one out, their way to influence the world is through politics. And so, of course, both parties have an obligation and a duty to give a true seat at the table to ordinary people who can't call up the head of Google and get their opinions heard. And that it is, in fact, a problem. The reason we're having this populist moment in the first place is that neither party for the last 20 years has done enough of that, where up until probably the 80s and 90s, there was a way to get a seat at the table and a voice. The union guy who was a member of Congress was a normal thing. He was a high school educated guy who rose up through the ranks at the Teamsters and then became a member of Congress. That was a thing that happened, and now it does not. Now the idea is to be a populist is to give nice things to people, not to give them a seat at the table of power themselves. And that, of course, is what's created this populist moment. So that's, I think that I don't reject the distinction, but I see it differently.
Final question, the gentleman on Facebook. Yes, because of your previous.
Okay. I would like to know that basically in 16 and 20, Bernie Sanders got a lot of support. This past election, Bernie Sanders got a lot of support. I'm curious to know, because they're both sides are not really happy with these two candidates. I think before years might get election, but I would like the election to have been Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis, but not this time. I'd like to know, for the people who may and probably end up voting for these two candidates but are not happy with them, don't think Biden's progressive enough, or don't think Trump is conservative enough, or didn't do what he promised, are these people who are unhappy, are they populists, or what are they?
Fascinating. Mr. Speaker, take it however you like.
Mr. Chair, I wouldn't. What makes somebody a populist? What makes something a populism? And there's a robust scholarly consensus about this. Like, there's plenty of books about it. What makes it populism is people versus the elite. Because there's left-wing populism and there's right-wing populism, right? I mean, there's been populisms for 150 years, or, we could say since there's been human beings, there's been populism. But what makes it a populism is not the substance of what you believe. It is, if your framing is, there is a people and there is an elite, and we are the people and they are the elite, and we need to get power and they shouldn't have it. So, to the extent that is your argument, that we need to get the elite out of power so the people can rule, then it is a populism. If you are representing the people through the democratic process in the arena, I would say you're not a populist. You are what you're supposed to be. You're a democratic politician listening to your constituents. And there's lots of different groups of constituents. Bernie Sanders represents a group of Americans. Ron DeSantis represents a different group of Americans, and they should both be part in the arena and being heard and getting all the things they need and some but not all of the things that they need.
And that, Speaker, is thanked. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. I don't know what your format is, but I'll take the question. No, since you skipped, that's fine. It's your prerogative to skip. I had my hand up at the beginning, but from a format standpoint, I think we're at the point now where we're, in the second wave of the final speakers. And particularly the most recent speakers interchanging words and language that is just completely not connecting with the purpose or you're supposed to be moderating the debate, right?
I am.
And so I think it's really unfair for us, aside from being with no clue how to get involved in putting it unless you choose to cause, that we're intertwining words like, governments and government and politicians and populism and factions and interest groups, like as if everybody's in agreement as to how those are intertwined.
I understand, sir.
With the debate question, and so.
Sir, I need to give the remaining speakers the time on the floor. The brief answer to this is that I do not, and no great range as debate chair ever will, define terms for the speakers, because part of the very essence of the discourse of great range of debate is that the speakers take the resolution as they will, and they bring their interpretation of it to the floor, and the negotiation of that is what makes the public discourse what it is. That's the situation there. That's why we encourage questions as much as we can, and as much cross-examination as we can, because that's the way that we get to people's mutual understandings. It's not by providing objectivity from the top down, but letting the discourse level from the bottom up. I will go to further questions further on, but I need to let the speaker speak. With that, I'm looking for another speech in the affirmative.
I didn't hear this word you said.
Ms. Stuber.
In the next round, I look forward to your question.
I will.
For another speech in the affirmative.
And in response to some of that, the title being is populism a force for good in democracy? I will define populism as the rights of workers or those perhaps making less than 100,000 or maybe a little more per year over the rights of special interests on the top. But it can be widely defined. But I originally wrote this for, is populism a force for good in the Republican Party? But I will address both. And so addressing that, with millions of Democrats from blue-collar working class leaving the Democratic Party, many of them coming to the Republican Party, the era of the Republican Party of attempts to repeal health care and to privatize Social Security are over, and they are not coming back. People have spoken, and these widely unpopular ideas that do not serve the common person are coming to an end with more participation in our elections and democracies. Donald Trump said to Ron DeSantis that any candidate that would advocate for any of those two unpopular ideas would be like pushing themselves off a cliff in a wheelchair. And if we really, truly, as Americans, believe, and I do speak to former Democrats and as a former progressive activist, in human rights, in labor rights, protections against child labor, if we believe in we care about environmental protections, we are concerned about climate change, and we also believe in the American democracy ideal of being able to choose your leaders, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, religious liberty, and against genocide, then we should not be importing and trading goods with countries like China that do not support any of those things. I believe that Donald Trump's populist policies for free and fair trade are the best thing to happen to the Republican Party, and they're also one of the worst things to happen to the Democratic Party, because it exposed the hypocrisy of a party that claimed to stand for unions and for workers, while those policies sending jobs overseas and making people compete with the wages of people making almost nothing only undermines those very unions and workers
nor would I say that it is compassionate to import millions of people from desperate countries who will not have any rights, who will be treated as second-class citizens and placed in vulnerable positions where anything they work for could be taken away at a moment's notice if they complain or do try to fight for their workers' rights. And so I also think that placating those jobs that were sent overseas with welfare policies also has not been what has lifted people out of poverty. What lifts people out of poverty are good quality jobs. The freedom to not be dependent on subsidized housing, on food share, to have your own income, to determine where you want to live and what it is that you want to buy. The Bernie Sanders populism that punishes corporations or large companies and increases taxes on them may seem populist, but the consequence is that it pushes those jobs even farther away. And so I do believe that the Republican Party has an opportunity to embrace this populist sentiment and combine it with their business acumen to make conditions that will bring jobs here, that will create a win-win situation and work with corporations. And so I do believe that there does need to be a party that stands against the exploitation of workers, against labor trafficking, and against in conditions that create low wages for everybody. And at this time, I do not believe that it is the major part of the Democratic Party at this time. And so I think that we should embrace populism, because even though as a former progressive and Democrat, it may seem some of the language, I think we need to look beyond the language and the titles and really look at the policies that will create the conditions that we need to create better quality jobs that will lift people out of poverty and create peace and prosperity.
And with that, speakers, thanks. Thank you very much for That's it. So we'll go to questions for the speaker. I have just a very brief preliminary. Oh, and move a little bit forward so the camera can still does the speaker believe it would be healthy for there to be populist wins in both parties?
Yes, but as I said, any form of populism that does increase taxes on corporations or wants to punish corporations is detrimental to, we'll just send them more overseas, which is the grievance that a lot of people have been having.
Further questions for the speaker? The lady from Washington, D.C.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering,
Thank you.
you're now speaker. I'm wondering how Madam Speaker would respond to the argument that she brings up union labor as being very important for populism, and also the importance of not having to rely on subsidized housing, affordable housing. I'm wondering how she would incorporate the fact that unions have historically opposed increased construction and have often demanded union labor to build housing, which makes housing much more expensive to build, makes it take much longer, makes it much less efficient, and ultimately ends up with less housing and higher prices for people.
Thank you.
I'm fine with union labor being used for housing. I do think that there is, hopefully a spirit where there's a reasonable negotiation that can be made that doesn't go too much to the one side where it is unreasonable and does significantly increase that price. But I would advocate for using that over using workers from other countries that do not have the protections that citizens of this country have in their labor.
All right, very brief follow-up.
So I have a follow-up for the speaker, which is, she brings up the exploitation of migrant workers. Couldn't that exploitation be remedied by giving them work permits?
I do believe that people should be sponsored for work permits, or they should not be hired. And I do support the verified system as well. In all other industries, if you're a doctor or professor, your company has to sponsor a visa for you. And so I think that should be on the employers.
I appreciate the integration of political economy into this debate, as that gives on some of the North Minnesota aspects here. For another question, the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yes, so the quick context or preface, I'm spun around by, we're getting into talking about issues. And
that's what happens at a Brave Angels debate.
I appreciate the broad definition of populism and democracy, but I think it's pretty safe to say that we're all here in acknowledgement that it's not a form of government and it's not an economic system. And we're talking about all these issues that fall under those categories. I find it kind of confusing, but so maybe to phrase it in a question, Mr. Chair, for the person who's speaking is, what is it about the conditions and the interactions and the activities of populism that you think are either a credit or a discredit to achieving the kind of public policy? You list a lot of public policy outcomes, but almost in the context of being like a candidate for office, for example. But I'm not here to talk about whether you win an election, not you personally, but whether anybody in this room wins an election or anybody else for that matter, but the condition of democracy, so it's like I want my healthcare to be wellness, but not whether or not I should use my right arm more or my left arm more, you know what I mean? So what is it exactly about populist gathering, populist organizing that you see is either, in context of our debate question, a force for good to achieve the kinds of things you rattled off, or a detriment to the kinds of things that you rattled off?
Mr. Question, this is a very good question, and I appreciate it being up for it. Next speaker.
I would say that it is kind of elitist to sit here and talk about a bunch of theories and abstract concepts instead of actual practical policies that will create the conditions that will improve the quality of life for most people.
Let's go.
That just shuts down my conversation.
Do you want to clarify?
Hold on. Mr. Question, the speakers are always allowed to answer however they want. Speakers are required.
Well, I meant it in quotation marks.
Thank you, Mr. Question. Let's go to further questions from the speaker. The gentleman in green.
What does the speaker think of America's storied protectionist tradition as opposed to free and fair trade, or as opposed to free trade?
I am in full support of our protectionism, and I believe that will protect the jobs of people here in a globalist society, and I respect the rights of all countries to enforce the same.
And with that, I'm going to call questions for this place.
I do want to clarify you can clarify what his question was.
Yeah, actually, we'll go to one more. So the gentleman in blue was asking, why is populism the right way to address the imbalances and the injustices in political economy and in political representation that you, Madam Speaker, see as bad? Why is populism the way to address all trade things, all labor things, all that?
When you say populism, as in caring more about the concerns of the majority of the common people over special interests of their elite, why is that more important?
Take 30 seconds and answer.
But that's the question, right?
Why is it either useful or not useful to your
Sir, I need to keep this up on that.
Yeah.
Well, I was just clarifying the question.
I mean, I don't think that anything to the contrary would be something that most people would agree with. So, so what you're saying is it would be better to, why do I not want to be more concerned about the elite or special interests over the common person? I guess no.
Yep, just say what you're going to say and then you're all set.
Okay. I guess I'm still not understanding the question.
I think you answered it pretty well.
Okay.
I think you answered it.
I guess I can't really find an argument to the contrary.
And with that, we're ready for the moderator these things. Thank you very much, man. Let's go to a final speech to the negative from Mr. Hausman, Public Housing, Illinois. Mr. Hausman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will try to keep it brief so we have more time for questions. But really quick, I think a lot of what it was said shows the beauty of what Bravery Angels tries to do, because there is a lot of common ground up here. Because I want to give a couple of concessions right away to things that were said in the affirmative. And that is populism as a social movement, and people and the working class fighting for their rights is a good thing. I absolutely agree with that. And that they do have justifiable reasons, as was mentioned, from the 90s and early 2000s, the impact of the global recession and the recovery being more to the elite, so to speak. So that does have a positive impact. But when we talk about the definition of populism, I'm talking about populist leaders, the people who go in there and, as you mentioned, are the ones that try to frame it as the real people versus the elites. That's where we start to come into problems with that definition of populism. I am a very unsuccessful politician who tried the Abraham Lincoln approach. Very unsuccessful. I did not make it on the primary. But that was the message I was going for. So there are probably better ones who could have said it better than me. But the reason for this, that us versus them, is the problem with populist leaders. I would, somebody mentioned Viktor Orban, and I would go with, yes, he has been effective in one way, but he has also cracked down on that kind of liberal traditions of free press and so to speak. And this gets to kind of a crux of the matter, and it was the ends justify the means. And I think this is something where a populist might be willing to say the ends justify the means. We don't care about all that fancy stuff in the Middle East and all that. We just want you to get the job done. We want inflation low. We want jobs. We want whatever. We don't care how you do it, but we just need that done. The ends justify the means. Where our tradition in America is that the process matters. It might be messy. We might not get what we want. But this is important to make sure we're protecting that liberal tradition. That the people aren't being left behind, that don't have that tyranny of the majority. And then I want to give a little bit of historical context, because that ends justify the means, that comes from Machiavelli. Machiavelli studied the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the phrase bread and circus, that was the old style of populism. This concept of trying to get power and maintaining power. Machiavelli said it was more important to maintain the love of people than the leaders, because then you can control them more. So that bread and circus, you would have the really tyrannical emperors who would make sure that they had, the common people have food, they had the entertainment of the gladiator games and such, to the detriment of the Senate. That's the concept I take in of populism. And as far as the populism of governance, we see that today's Bastille Day. One of the more modern populist uprisings, the French Revolution. But that was followed by the Reign of Terror. And you had all those people, because they were saying, I am the one that represents the people. I'm the one. That's an elite. We got to chop off his head. And then that person would get their head chopped off later on, because you had that circle. Everyone saying they were the true representative of the people. That is the populism that I think is dangerous. If there's anything I really want to talk about beyond that, because I want to open up for questions. The other aspect, because I don't think it was mentioned, is the other part of it that kind of concerns me about populism is the search and the reason for populist leaders to try to get black and white, really simple answers and simple solutions to problems, rather than the nuance that's really needed. When we're talking about trade policy, when we're talking about the economy, people just, for example, somebody talked about inflation when I was running. One of the things I called for was that the Fed should end its dual mandate. Now, the average voter won't even know what that's talking about. But they hear the phrase, and the Fed, and the Fed, and the Fed. But they don't even know what that dual mandate is. And that's the difference between populism and nuance, the simple solutions versus the real way of solving the problem. And when you have those populist leaders giving those simple solutions, we don't solve problems. Solve problems. You'll see that, I would say our Congress right now has the most populist leaders we've ever had. Our Congress right now are the ones that say they represent the people. Absolutely, I represent them. But then they don't want to work together because they don't want to be seen working with the elites, the other side. And so that's why we can't get anything done in Congress now, because of that rise of populism. So with that, I'll yield the rest of my time for questions. So let's go to questions.
Yeah, would the speaker say that our current setup of having these public debates and kind of theatrical performances is part of what's causing this versus before TV and perhaps even radio, people more had to read what the policies of the person instead of basing it off their charisma or personality?
I think the questioner makes a good point, because I think that kind of that shortened attention span helps lead to those demagogic populist leaders, because they want to make it in very quick sound bites instead of the nuance. You want that 5-second vital moment rather than the in-depth discussions, and I think that is a major concern that causes our problems.
Question from the lady in the floral box.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to put this as a question.
Thank you.
I am a little concerned about the ends justifying the means comment. I feel that it is directed towards, I feel that the speaker is directing that towards a group that perhaps has sentiments that are expressed in a more simple way. Let's say pro-American stance, people that are concerned about this trend towards anti-American sentiment. And so the opposite reaction is we are patriotic, and that would then be populist, and then that would be a group that you are attributing ends justifying the means. So my question is, am I correct that you're making this connection? That the speaker is making that connection?
And I could have misspoken, and so when I'm talking about, say, the ends justify the means, maybe in that concept, is say you're concerned about a lack of patriotism or anti-American language and stuff, and we need more patriotism. If you're just talking about somebody, you're the universal you, are just
I talk about a lot of things.
The universal you, and one would be talking about patriotism and all that. That's great. That's not necessarily populism. However, you start to go into populism when, I keep using you in universal.
This use of the second person pronoun you to the they in general.
Yes.
So you is very much.
They use, that's how we talk here.
Exactly.
There you go.
Use.
I'm going to, well, I'm kind of, I was going to get slightly off here, but the difference would be the ends justify means that, we need to crack down on unpatriotic language in schools. That would be kind of the people pushing for that, I would say, are the populists that goes too far and goes against the American tradition. If it's simply, we need more patriotic, we need to have Pledge of Allegiance, that's fine. But we can't have, if we're trying to control what is said in an academic environment, that's the difference between the ends justify the means. That in both cases, both those fictional people want increased patriotism, but it's how you're doing it. Are you doing it while still protecting the freedom of speech and the rights of somebody to dissent, or are you cracking down on that dissent in order to get that more than patriotism? So hopefully that distinction answers the questioners.
And for my final question from the gentleman in the back in the brown shirts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find that in social discussions, in political discussions, how people define terms becomes really important, becomes very charged. Two terms that have been used a lot today, one is the liberal tradition or illiberalism, and another is elites. And I would like to ask the speaker how he would define those terms.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker.
So I would go with thank you to the questioner, when I talk about the little L liberalism, that's that Enlightenment era, the idea of protecting the liberties of the individual. So that kind of classical liberalism is what I refer to. In that case, illiberal is going, what I would say, a little bit more with that, being willing to trample on some of those liberties for the greater good, for whatever that might be. The other definition, elites. And I think the elites, that always completely depends. I don't like the distinction of elite, because if you're talking about left-wing populism, you have the capitalist elites that they're going against. On the right-wing populism, you have the academic and media elites. So I say the phrase elites because it's a populist version of them, the other. That's how I define elites. How the elites are defined completely depends on the populists themselves often.
And that, the speaker is, thank you. I want to get to one more round of speeches from each of our speakers. It's going to be a slightly different order than the one we did last time. These speeches will be 2 to 3 minutes or so, still in alternating affirmative and negative, and we might take questions on each of them, or if no questions rise up, we will go to the next speaker. So we will do this one quick round. I'm looking for another speech in the affirmative. Mr. Wright.
I just want to reflect on some of what I heard from the other speakers. One, I really appreciate the idea of the third dimension or the second dimension of populism, and this idea of populism as the people coming together. And so I think that although that's maybe a slightly different thing than we're talking about here, and I think many people talk about populism in the electoral politics sense, that is an important part of the American tradition that we've lost. And maybe the question is how we get it back. I don't know that that's easy as well. It also makes me think of Yuval Leavened's new book, American Covenant, talking about our constitutional tradition and how he views the Constitution as the solution. That our government and Congress in particular being the vehicle by which we come together to make these decisions. And that has increasingly become not the case as our government doesn't do that. Just thinking about the sources of illiberalism, I think in many respects the source of illiberalism has actually been in our government itself, much more so than in the populist movement. And I think particularly about the COVID pandemic, where governors and other officials basically just said they could declare a state of emergency and rule by decree, condition employment on taking these things through government fiat, which was overturned by the courts, but they certainly attempted to do that. Say liquor stores can be open, but churches can't meet. Many other things there. The rise of administrative decision-making, prosecutors who simply arbitrarily de facto repeal laws by saying, I'm no longer going to enforce this law. I think to the extent that there's a liberal tradition, it's actually coming out of our governing institutions as much as it's coming out of others. And so we need to restore, I think, the democratic functioning of something like Congress, like our state legislatures, in terms of becoming that venue for us to make these decisions together. But again, how do we do that? How do we make Congress functional? I don't know how to do that, but I think we need to be looking in that direction.
Questions for the speaker? Seeing no question. For a question, the lady in the black.
Hi, Mr. Chair. I want to know what the speaker's thoughts are on whether current modern populist movements are being productive in strengthening institutions. I'm thinking specifically of our electoral institutions.
Mr. Speaker.
No.
All right, let's go to another speech, Mr. Discovery.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to address the second round of questions at addressing what I think is the big question that I've been picking up from all of you. And that has been, is it possible, and how would you build a movement that was not populist in the sense in which I said it, which is the people versus the elites, illiberal, all of these other ideas, but that actually represents the people and gets things done. So I want to throw out an example, a couple of historical examples. But Teddy Roosevelt. You look at Teddy Roosevelt. Why is he considered this great president, right? What was this movement about? And so this is the turn of the 20th century. This is a time where America looks a lot like now. This is the end of the Gilded Age, where there's corruption, where there are these new massive corporations. There's this economic revolution that has made certain people very, very wealthy, and the middle class is falling very behind. People are angry and they're upset, and we have the populist movement that our esteemed professor here was talking about with the Grange and these farmers movements. All right, so how do we have a populism, if you will, but that's not a populism, but that deals with people. And you look at what Teddy Roosevelt did. It's a way to actually solve problems. It's not about winning power for us and ramming things through. It's procedural. It works with democracy. But it's about substance. It's about getting things done, not things that are perfect. And you look at all the things they accomplished in that era, whether it be ending the 14-hour workday and ending child labor, all the abuses, breaking up monopolies that were abusive, to make sure that ordinary middle-class Americans were able to have a good life, creating the national park system because we were losing green places and people didn't have a place to play, cleaning up pollution in the environment, and all of these things that people wanted without all of the people versus the powerful let's grab for government. And there were other examples. I would talk about Lincoln. I think this is Lincoln's version of the Republican Party was built on these principles. John Quincy Adams was built on these principles. And they're very different from a Huey Long. The type of populism we do not need is the Huey Long, where we decide, give me all of the power, and I will fix all of your problems. Here are some simple solutions to make every man a king, and give me power, and that was his slogan, he will make every man a king. So give me the power, and I will give you the world. That is the problem.
Yeah, well, that's for the speaker. Let's go to a question for the gentleman who's got it.
With the increase in money that's being spent on campaigns, and it seems that it seems like whoever has the most money is the one who wins. So how could you, without a populist movement of the people saying, we want to be the ones that decide rather than the people who give the money, how would that be, how would the problem of campaign finance be solved without populism?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually think that is a slightly out-of-date framing. And that's why you don't get wrong with campaign finance reform. Because campaign finance reform really matters when people are not paying attention and not engaged. Because money wins races through television ads and media. And media and television ads wins races when people aren't engaged and not really paying attention, and then they see this ad on TV and they hear the name and they go vote. And I don't think we live in that world. I think most people are pretty engaged and paying attention right now. And this is not to say that campaign finance reform or making sure everyone can engage in politics isn't essential. I just think that in this polarized environment where people are so politically tuned in, I don't think television ads, I think if you're going to vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I don't think that television ad makes any difference at this point. I don't think it matters on which party you vote for in the Senate or in the House. I think people know what they stand for and what they believe, and that worked 15 years ago because people didn't care as much and they didn't see as much difference. And so seeing an ad for a candidate matters. So that's my sense on that. It's not saying we shouldn't do anything about it, but what matters is engagement.
Now, with that, the speaker is thanked. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let's get to another speech in the affirmative, Ms. Gutenberg. I'm going to get right on speech, sir.
Okay, I guess I would still say populism is a force for good, and I guess to me, this conversation, unlike maybe another one, was just a lot of very abstract theories and not concrete things, and I think that people want to hear the concrete policies that will bring about positive changes on their lives, and I do think that campaign financing, overturning Citizens United, or not making conditions so that politicians are not so beholden to large donors who will be the ones who influence races. Though I do believe right now we do have, I know at the Republican Party specifically, anyone can register and you can go vote for your local candidates, and you do have the opportunity to choose who is running for you. But some laws on campaigns requiring you to need $1 million before you can do that. I do think there are a lot of benevolent people that have a lot of money or are in positions of influence that do care about people, but I think you sometimes also run the risk that that may not always be the case, and they may not be in touch and just looking out for themselves. And I know that is a concern with the current candidates that we have as well. And so I do think that I think more campaign finance or opportunities for people that aren't billionaires to be involved would be beneficial to society.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Any questions for the Speaker? Any questions for the Speaker? And with that, the Speaker is thanked. Let's go to a speech in the negative from Ms. Cannon.
So I think a lot of my speech is going to be sort of in conversation with the gentleman from North Carolina, because it is not every day that you get to share the stage with someone who worked with Martin Luther King. That's quite tremendous. So I would be delighted if he could devote at least some of his response to some of the things that I'm about to say. I'm genuinely curious and looking forward to what he might have to say. So I think the gentleman through most of his first speech, in my view, builds a vision of liberal populism. For example, the civil rights movement focused on things like equality before the law, bringing into the fore for African Americans the promise that all men are created equal. They relied on peaceful demonstrations that were constitutionally protected, though of course their rights were frequently violated. And however, I do want to push back just a bit on the idea that the civil rights movement was populism, and I think that's because through the course of this debate, I've been thinking about maybe an extra hitch to my definition of populism, which is that I think populist movements almost exclusively frame themselves as the majority. The us is much larger than the them, either because they are in fact in the majority, or they frame themselves as such. And I think during the civil rights movement, civil rights were not popular. They were not in the majority. And I think those activists knew it, right? And in fact, so many of the gains from the civil rights movement were not gained by a vote. They came, for example, from the Supreme Court saying, no, we were wrong, separate is not equal. From Congress with the Civil Rights Act. And in fact, if civil rights have been put for a vote, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is that I believe interracial marriage was not supported by more than 50% of Americans until what, the 1990s? And so part of what made the civil rights movement the most successful activist movement in American history, at least I think, is that it ended up achieving its goals not through populist means, and in fact by appealing to values that I personally do not think are very populist at all. This, we are all equal under the law, the fact that all Americans should be brought together regardless of their race. These very universal values that to me are inconsistent with the populist mission generally of us versus them. But again, I very much welcome this figure from the gentleman from North Carolina, because I'm fascinated to say.
And with that, the Speaker is thanked. Do we have any questions for our Speaker? Real quick, for a question from Mr.
Okay, the Speaker has said at certain times, certain things that we now consider as bad, being against civil rights or being against interracial marriage, unfortunately were supported by the majority at that time, but people vote, and if the majority supports something that's bad and they vote for something that is bad or immoral, what does the Speaker suggest is the alternative to our current situation for addressing that or preventing those things from happening?
The Constitution. This is why I think the First Amendment is the most important thing that Americans have, because it defends your ability to be in the minority, to hold unpopular views. And if I brought this example up earlier, but if 51% of Americans wanted to make it illegal to have certain political views, hate speech often gets brought up. That can't happen. Without a tremendously difficult constitutional amendment that is certainly never going to occur. And that protects people's ability to be wrong or to be right. And so I think the fact that other people's rights are generally not up for a vote in this country It's fantastic. So for example, Switzerland relies very heavily on direct democracy, and Swiss women didn't get full suffrage until the 1990s because it was up to Swiss men, generally speaking.
And with that, the speaker from Washington, D.C. is thank you very much. Let us go to a final speech from Mr. Boyd.
Let me also encourage Mr. Zepnik, who was a populist legislator here for many years, to be invited. Just before, let me talk, and then you can, I hope you can ask a question. So I think it's been very productive. I think there is some recognition that populism is not simply electoral antics by people, us and them bashing each other, which could be cultural bashing as well as other things. But violence and invocation of violence, us versus them, is really taking a dark turn. And when you treat people as consumers, not as responsible citizens, you get a kind of diminution of the whole public culture, and a meanness, and a brutality, and a lack of spirit. So I want to do two things quickly. I want to read a good quote that's a populist quote in my judgment from a great poet, Walt Whitman, in his preface to Leaves of Grass in 1855. This is what, in my view, a democratic, populist spirit that comes out of the people. I mean, he didn't hang around too much with ones. He hang around with shopkeepers, laborers, people who were freed slaves. Other states indicate themselves to their deputies, but the genius of the United States is not best or most in its executives or legislators, but always most in the common people. Their attachment to freedom, their acknowledgement of the citizens of one state, not the citizens of all other states. Now the president's taking off his hat to them, not the other way around. The largeness of nature or the nation were monstrous without a corresponding largeness and generosity of the spirit of the citizen. Now, I think that's what we have to do. I mean, politicians play a role. It was a big love Lincoln, but politicians are not the drivers of the culture of the spirit. So I just want to draw attention to one other dimension of this, which is a concept I worked on with a former colleague, Sarah Evans. Free spaces. We came out of the civil rights movement with this concept. This was the University of Chicago 1992 edition, which answers our critics. So this is the idea that movements, populist or other, can be determined not by left or right as much as democratic or authoritarian. And the authoritarian version is exclusive. It's a narrow version of the people. It actually tries to purify the people. The democratic version is expansive and pluralist and educative. I would say the civil rights movement was full of those kinds of spaces. And non-violence played an important role. And the way it was framed played a role. Although the March on Washington is remembered as a protest, it wasn't a protest. Byron Rustin, the great organizer of the march, described it not explicitly not as a protest. It was a conversation with the American people, a living petition which would show how the movement's goals for expanded democracy were the same as the country's goals for expanded democracy. And if you look at King's speech, it was a great operationalizing of that vision. But nonviolence in all sorts of practices and all sorts of settings lifted up the human dignity even of the enemy, of the segregationists. That's why King was so enthusiastic about my talking to the Klan. In fact, he assigned me to organize with pro-whites, which I did for them, Southern Mill Village for 7 years in Durham, North Carolina. Here it is. 27. So I want to leave with a kind of challenge that we recover the greatness of the spirit of the citizen that Walt Whitman was so eloquent about. It does not come mainly from legislators and politicians and platforms, but rather from the self-organizing, democratic, interactive, expansive experiences and work of the citizens.
And let's take a very good question from Sure.
Mr. Chair, with trying to keep track of all the questions. With the speaker, just in response to some of the other comments that were just made by some of the other folks, would you agree or disagree or expand on whether or not with certain key historical things, events, actions we've been all talking about, things like Brown v. Board, or some things that have happened more recently in the last 20 years, or even the drafting and creation of the Constitution itself, just would magically appear on an agenda or were the result of an electoral election and being administered, or were they were they products that grew out of some level or some formation of populism?
Organizing it.
Thank you. What would you agree or disagree and explain?
Okay. Well, I think the great advances in democracy in America have always had a very strong popular rootedness. In fact, the Constitution would never have been the Constitution, it wouldn't have been passed without widespread discussion and debate across the whole country, especially about the Bill of Rights. That's what sealed the deal. And I want to remind people that the 10th Amendment is about the retaining the power of the people, not relegated explicitly to the government. So, no, I think that actually there's always in American history a popular, democratic, self-organizing dimension to the demands.
And with that, speakers, thank you very much. Mr. Hausman, take it away.
All right. So first of all, thank you to the panelists, thank you to all of you, and I will just simply say how to help their statement. Populist demagoguery is bad. And that'll open up the questions.
Actually, yes, one brief question, gentlemen.
Okay, yeah, so Joe mentions a martyr on one side, Larry Hogan's a martyr on another side. They're both disliked by the majority of their parties, but I guess trying to get in the middle. Ocasio-Cortez and Taylor Greene are both loved by their side. So given that circumstance, do you understand why people will sound more, populist, I guess, in messaging to get elected and to get a following?
Well, in response to the question, and we could have another debate about that, I think that has a lot to do with our current electoral system and the incentives appealing to that populist base on the far left and far right to get elected. Maybe that's just a bitter former centrist candidate that ran this. Hold on,
and that speaker is thanks. Thank you very much. I have kept you all a little bit here too long, and so we're going to adjourn in just a moment. But after we adjourn, we need at least 2 or 3 minutes to do one thing we do after every Braver Angels debate. So as soon as I tap the gavel and call us out of order, please stay, and we will do our last bit of business. This being a fine series of speeches on the resolution resolved. Populism is a force for good in American democracy. I am looking for an appropriate motion to adjourn this debate. Do we have an appropriate motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second to that motion?
Second.
With that, I call this debate out of order. You are all welcome to diss each other and me in the second person pronoun. There are 2 questions we ask at the end of every Braver Angels debate. One of them is, what did you learn? The second one is, what did you enjoy? We don't have too much longer, but I want to get at least a few of these in. So, anybody, did you learn anything? Did you enjoy anything? Frank, what did you learn? What did you enjoy?
What I learned is there's different views of populism, and that this is what the gentleman in the blue, I think, was getting to.
But don't continue. Okay, just say what you learned.
Well, we have different views of it, and that one of the difficulties in having this discussion is that we bring so much different flavor of what we need, and that making sure that we know what we mean by populism is not is maybe an important part of defanging the downsides.
Tells you something about the American public discourse right now, right? Anyways, what did you enjoy?
I enjoyed all of it, but I like the stories that come on.
Thank you for being here. Kids, what did you learn? What did you enjoy?
I learned a lot, and what I enjoyed was the thoughtful, measured, respectful discussion discussion that was watered throughout with humor and grace and kindness.
I just really enjoyed knowing that we wouldn't agree on what populism was, just expanding my view of all the things that can be put under the umbrella of populism on the left and on the right.
I would like to go especially to our two friends who are new out to Braver Angels, Aaron and Emma. Aaron, did you learn or enjoy anything?
Yeah, again, I enjoy hearing the stories about the civil rights movement, which is obviously before my time, so I don't have as much personal insight into that. So that was good to learn about, and I enjoyed getting to come to Milwaukee and come to this beautiful facility to talk about the issues.
Thanks for being here with us.
I learned that the only thing harder than giving a speech on populism for 6 minutes is giving a speech on populism for 6 minutes while holding a giant laptop. I also enjoyed the stories of the civil rights movement. That's fantastic.
I learned some of my limitations as a chair of Braver Angels Debate, and I find that very important, and that is going to help me be a better chair in the coming years. So I thank everybody here who gave me some practice there, and I enjoyed every minute of that. I think lastly, I would like to ask two people without whom this event would not have happened. Cameron and Matt, what did you learn? What did you enjoy? Cameron?
I'm too late to have learned much, but I really enjoyed remembering some of the positive aspects of populism, because honestly, in my mind and heart, it has become something to fear. And to remember that it can be channeled as a force for good was an important and comforting thought today.
Thank you for everything that you did to make it for everybody else too. And Matt, apologies for your previous campaign. What did you learn?
So I learned very much echoing what Cameron said, and is that I kind of came in expecting us to have some common ground on different versions of populism, but I definitely learned those with civil rights and all the history, those really positive aspects of especially the progressive era of the early 20th century and stuff. And what I enjoyed was really going last, so I could just.
And with that, I am very grateful that everybody was here. I just want to let you all know a couple last bits of logistics. This was a Braver Angels debate. We do this in the Coliseum format with our very, very expert friends in all different walks of life in Washington, D.C., New York City, and now at the national conventions. If you happen to be with us in Chicago next month, we're going to be doing a very similar Coliseum debate on the resolution resolved. Progressivism is a force for good in American democracy. Same subject here, but going on to a different format. I'm quite excited for that and to see some of you there. But this debate format is not just something we do with our expert friends. This is something which, as you can tell with the spirit and vibe of this, we do with our fellow Americans from all walks of life, all the time. We do it on college campuses, we do it in church basements, we do it online with Braver Angels all the time. We sincerely believe that bringing public discourse and oratory back to people who never have the experience to do it is one of the great arts of American democracy that we can bring back, perhaps populistically, perhaps in other ways, as part of the work of bringing Americans back together across all of our political, cultural, and social divides. But debates are not all that Braver Angels does. Braver Angels does all kinds of workshops and all kinds of community organizing.